He's immensely seductive. Quite sure he's right. Obsessionally neurotic. Pretty dangerous, in fact.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories.
Do you mean you doubt your powers to convince him?
Say it! Say it!
All right, I'll say it.
Worse than that. What I'm afraid of is his power to convince me.
We're talking about putting a manifestly irresponsible man on national television.
Sweetheart, be reasonable.
What? This is the end game.
I mean, as long as you're reasonable. You have to be reasonable. We have to be reasonable. Thank you very much.
All right, everybody. It is Wednesday, April 16th, 2025, the 87th day of the Golden Age. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. Bit of an early start today. I hope that's okay with everyone. Hello to the viewers on Substack. Substack is now a streaming platform that I'm making use of, and I think that people are, by and large, enjoying that experience for the most part. I've received mostly positive feedback. Hello also to those of you in the Rumble chat on Rumble Premium, and thank you all, as always, for your continued support, because that is what makes it possible to do this. In the Dark, just right off the bat, gifted 5 subscriptions. So thank you very much for that. And let's go ahead and get into it. The fake and illegitimate president, Joe Biden, made his return yesterday, speaking before some group for disabled people, which is about as on the nose as you can get for this demented old pervert, or whatever his character is at this point. Our boy Blue came back to just show us all, really, what we are missing. And it's mostly hilarity.
100 days, this new administration has done so much damage and so much destruction. It's kind of breathtaking it could happen that soon. They've taken a Hassett to the Social Security Administration, pushing an additional 7,000 employees, 7,000 out the door in that time, including the most seasoned career officials. Now they're getting ready to push thousands more out the door. Already we can see the effects. For example, 100 days.
So Joe Biden talking about Donald Trump's first 100 days and how destructive that has been, I should say. Should we go ahead and remember some of what happened within the first 100 days of the fake inauguration of the fake and illegitimate president, Joe Biden? We had the COVID vaccination campaign, and I believe that the mandates were starting to get in place by the time he reached the late spring of 2021. I don't remember when exactly that was announced, and I didn't bother looking it up. I'm sure we could find it pretty quickly. But also the American Rescue Plan. He wiped out a whole bunch of Donald Trump executive orders, supposedly. And you would think that the media would consider that kind of an equal thing because they've been so upset at Donald Trump doing that sort of thing, using the executive orders. He canceled the Keystone Pipeline. He rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement and the World Health Organization. He ended the ban on transgenders in the military and had the DOJ investigate police practices in Louisville and Minneapolis, some of the BLM cities. He ended construction of the border wall. They went ahead with some of the climate goals. Of course, I said, rejoining the Paris climate deal. That was what we were dealing with in the first 100 days of Joe Biden. So what's more destructive? I think we would have to ask. Let's do another one of our boy Blue. Killing it. Absolutely killing it. Just the best. This guy is so entertaining. I don't know what's going on with him as a person, but it's funny.
We can't go on like this as a divided nation, as divided as we are. Like I said, I've been doing this a long time. It's never been this divided. Granted, it's roughly 30%, but it's a 30% that has no heart. What we see in America.
We're only 30%, you understand? MAGA's only 30%. And that's funny coming on the heels of polling that was out this week. Not that the polls are real, but that 70% of the Republican Party now self-identifies as MAGA, not just Republicans. We are Donald Trump Republicans. So that's 75% of the Republican Party, and we're supposed to believe, or 70%, sorry. And we're supposed to believe that only represents 30% of the nation, and that everybody else is therefore in opposition, with Trump's approval ratings over 50%, with an obvious and overwhelming mandate from the people, the raucous display whenever he enters any place at all, the response from retail investors when the stock market goes down and we're told all of this is Donald Trump's fault. The idea that Donald Trump is not overwhelmingly popular in America right now is a bit preposterous. Trump actually posted a clip of Biden's speech yesterday, and it's just such a funny little cut. We got to play this.
And I'd never seen hardly any black people in Scranton at the time I was only going in fourth grade. And I remember seeing the kids going by at the time called colored kids on a bus going by.
His whole speech was about dignity for disabled people. And he had to make sure to recount his experience in Scranton, having never really seen black people, and then seeing a bus of colored people drive by. Gotta love him. And one last clip. I actually maybe should have led off with this, but I saved it for the end because it's just so typical. He entered to music and began speaking while the music was still overpowering the microphone.
Thank you. Who deserve help and paid for. Thank you.
What a great speech. I cannot believe that they brought him back out. I mean, it's perfect for how this story has played out. And on all of those levels, I get it. It works. Wonderful. If it's under control, wonderful. But what are they doing? Trying to present an alternative to recall the good old days? It doesn't work when they roll Barack Obama out at this point. And they're rolling out Joe Biden, who is, I don't know, I guess reframed as a competent leader to people who are that Trump deranged. Good luck, commies. I don't know how that's going to work out. It's pretty funny, though. We have heard about the media crackdown from the Trump administration, and we are going to hear about more of it. This is Reuters today, actually. In the latest media crackdown, White House limits newswire access to Trump. And this is one of those things that doesn't seem like immediately a big deal, but could be when we consider how the newswires shape media narratives. They're kind of the feeding system for the downstream media narratives and stories, and then all of the emotional reactions and everything that makes up our media ecosystem. It has to start at some point. It starts with the newswire services and the intelligence agencies, and then it feeds into media companies who write about what they've been told by intelligence agencies, Defense Department, etc. and these newswire services. And then you have the entire kind of influencer complex just emoting about what they've seen on television. And this is at the top of that food chain. Wire services, including Reuters and Bloomberg News, will no longer hold a permanent slot in the small pool of reporters who cover President Donald Trump, the White House said on Tuesday, as it moves to exert greater control over who gets to ask him questions and report on his statements in real time. The decision comes after the Trump administration last week lost a court challenge brought by another wire service, the Associated Press, over its earlier exclusion from the press pool. The pool typically consists of around 10 outlets that follow the president wherever he goes, whether it is a meeting in the Oval Office where he makes statements or answers questions, or trips at home or abroad. Under the new policy, wire services will lose their customary spot in the pool and will instead be part of a larger rotation with about 30 other newspapers and print outlets. Given their mission to deliver real-time information to other news organizations and readers, wire services tend to cover the president and the White House more closely on a daily basis than most outlets. Other media customers, particularly local news organizations that have no presence in Washington, rely on the wires for up-to-date reporting, video, and audio. Financial markets are also dependent on the wire services' real-time reports of statements the president makes. And so that kind of assembly line for the bullshit in media is being disrupted. It doesn't mean they're going to go away completely. It's just that they're going to get access sometimes. And so if you only have access sometimes, and it's mixed up between a bunch of these organizations, and you're trying to run a wire service but can't put out real-time information, well, then the people who are downstream from the wire service or from the White House press pool are going to have to look to other outlets to be able to get that information quickly. And some of these wire services are going to have to do the same thing, one would imagine. And so that seems to be a major disruption, particularly because over the years, of course, we've discussed at length the relationship between organizations like the Associated Press and Reuters with elements of the global regime, with Big Pharma when it comes to Reuters. And those are critical factors in disseminating a global propaganda narrative. So I found that really interesting. We'll see what the effects are kind of over time. You have to wonder if there's going to be some level of exposure down the line for what some of these wire services were doing initially. I mean, if you misreport basic things about what the president is doing or frame them intentionally in ways that make the president look bad, you are having a significant effect on all the media and messaging that is going to spin off that kind of top of the ladder reporting for everyone else. We had a story last month, speaking of media bullshit, that we talked about on the podcast. It was related to an Elon Musk meeting over at the Pentagon. And the New York Times reported in this article, Pentagon set up briefing for Musk on potential war with China. This was March 20th. They reported that Elon was headed over to a Pentagon meeting where they were going to discuss war plans for China. And Elon was framed as someone with, obvious corporate interests in China, knowing about these war plans. And this was supposed to, in my estimation, this was supposed to be one of those stories like they used so often in the 2016 campaign and then throughout the first term, and have used many times since, where they report there's a leak about a meeting, and then they get the substance of what the meeting is about, and then that becomes the story that this person attended this meeting. This is a national security threat brought on us by the Trump administration. Elon Musk being allowed in to hear the details of Chinese war plans. But was that what the meeting was about? I would suggest that all of this was created to elicit that effect and to be able to report that story as an attack vector on the Trump administration. And let's just go through a little bit of recap here, because there was an update on all this over the last 24 hours. The Pentagon, this is March 20th, the Pentagon was scheduled on Friday to brief Elon Musk on the U.S. military's plan for any war that might break out with China, two U.S. officials said on Thursday. Another official said the briefing would be China-focused, without providing additional details. A fourth official confirmed Mr. Musk was to be at the Pentagon on Friday, but offered no details. Hours after news of the planned meeting was published by the New York Times, Pentagon officials and President Trump denied that the session would be about military plans involving China. China will not even be mentioned or discussed, Trump said in a late-night social media post. It was not clear if the briefing for Musk would go ahead as originally planned, but providing Mr. Musk access to some of the nation's most closely guarded military secrets would be a dramatic expansion of his already extensive role as an advisor to Mr. Trump and leader of his effort to slash spending and purge the government of people and policies they oppose. And I just want to hit one more paragraph here. The top secret briefing that exists for the China war plan has about 20 to 30 slides that lay out how the United States would fight such a conflict. It covers the plan beginning with the indications and warning of a threat from China to various options on what Chinese targets to hit, over what time period, that would be presented to Mr. Trump for decisions according to officials with knowledge of the plan. And so this seems like the substance of the leak here. What was actually in that plan? Why would anyone in the Pentagon be sharing this level of detail with the New York Times if it was over a war plan with China? That would be an obvious subversion of the chain of command and of national security. That would be terrible. That's not the sort of thing that Pentagon officials should be doing. That would be the indication of a quote unquote resistance, as we talked about with Miles Taylor last week, within the national security state. And if you are a Trump deranged Democrat or neocon, you think that's good. You want there to be resistance within the government because that makes it harder for Trump to carry out his agenda. And you think that that's some sort of justice. This is what responsibility they have to the American public. They always frame it as upholding their oath to the Constitution, in an obvious total inversion, because they are just definitionally violating that oath by usurping and subverting the commander-in-chief. Few things could be more obvious. So you put out all those plans, and then on the basis of 4 unnamed officials, you say that the purpose of Elon's meeting at the Pentagon is to be briefed on those plans. And Elon has then the Chinese connections. All of that, through implication, means that the Trump administration is actually working to the benefit of China and totally enthralled to whatever Elon Musk wants. So that would be support for the narrative that they've tried to run on Trump and Elon throughout the entire time. And when it comes to Trump, for the last 10 years, that he is a threat to national security. So the update, this is Axios from this morning. If I can just pull this up. Trump dashed secret Pentagon briefing on China. So Trump scuttled this. The meeting was exactly as they described, but it was Trump's doing. Trump, once the reporting came out, Trump decided, oh, Elon can't go now. Beyond tariffs and court battles over Trump policies, 2 pieces of White House palace intrigue emerged Tuesday. 1, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth suspended 2 top Pentagon officials, Dan Caldwell and Darren Selnick, as part of an investigation into who leaked word of a planned top secret briefing on China for Elon Musk. And so it seems maybe they've found out who at least 2 of the 4 people supposedly were leaking that story. The resistors in the Pentagon. Axios learned that Musk or Hegseth didn't just decide to call off that briefing after the leak. President Trump himself ordered staffers to kill it. What the F is Elon doing there? Make sure he doesn't go, Trump said, a top official recalled to Axios. So another unnamed official. And it's entirely possible that under the scenario I described, rather than the scenario they're describing, Trump could have that reaction. But it's also possible that that is a reframing of Trump's reaction in the first place. This implies that Trump didn't know what the Pentagon meeting with Elon Musk would be about. And then he found out, everyone knows now that Elon Musk is going to get secret access to, or privileged access, or however you want to describe it, to these Chinese war plans. Well, that can't happen. I don't trust Elon Musk. And of course, then we have another opportunity to illustrate the Trump and Musk split, as we were told was happening again last week with the Elon Musk and Peter Navarro back and forth. And then all of a sudden, little X is on Trump's plane on Saturday night. And so I guess they're BFF again. Continuing. Musk has annoyed several administration officials with his constant presence at the White House, his haphazard social media posts, and his slash and burn tactics at his Department of Government Efficiency. The planned Pentagon briefing, however, got him cross with the boss at the Resolute desk. POTUS still very much loves Elon, but there are some red lines, the official said. Elon has a lot of business in China, and he has good relations there. And this briefing just wasn't the right thing. Or it was misreported. Trump also said he wouldn't allow conflicts of interest with Musk on his watch, although critics doubt his sincerity. And who cares what critics doubt? Critics have doubted absolutely everything the Trump administration has said and done for the last 10 years, and they have been right a total of 0 times. And we can see them just being blatantly wrong on a daily basis right now with this whole Abrego Garcia thing. And we don't need to get into that. I mean, every podcast in the world has covered that story in the last 2 days. And Brian and I talked about it a bit on Badlands Daily yesterday. I don't think we need to spend our time getting into the details of that sort of thing. But let's go to some of the, more big pictures that we've been focused on lately, which is where I think the substance of what's happening right now really is. We are seeing a breaking apart of the top-down centralized global regime structure in terms of media, in terms of economics, in terms of resources and trade routes. And then obviously you get up to the top with military, and it does not seem any longer like the global regime has any sway in terms of what the U.S. military is doing. The neocons are not winning the argument anywhere. They didn't win it in Ukraine. They didn't win it in Israel. They're not winning it in Iran. They're not going to win it on Taiwan if we ever get to that point. And who knows, maybe they'll go for Venezuela and Korea as well, but they're not going to get it there either. It just doesn't work anymore because they don't have the control. No one listens to them. Everyone is beginning to see through the trick. And in terms of the economic bit, we've been talking about that a lot over the past couple of weeks. So let's spend some time on that today. This is from Meet the Press on Sunday. This is billionaire investor Ray Dalio.
For our viewers, I think it's important to note you consider yourself to be apolitical, and you say that the tariff problem is a symptom of a much greater problem. What do you mean by that?
There's a financial problem. There's an imbalance problem. There are basically 5 big forces through history that drive everything. First, there's the money, credit, debt, economic cycle in which there's a building up of debt in a cyclical way that becomes too large, and we're going to have problems. We're going to have a government debt problem. Maybe we can get into this. The second big force through time is the internal conflict force, the left and the right, differences in wealth and values causing a conflict that we're seeing it changing our political order. So the first is changing our monetary order. The second is changing our political order internally. And then the third is the great world order, how countries deal with each other. When there's a rising power, challenging an existing power. And now we are going from multilateralism, which is largely an American world order type of thing, to a unilateral world order in which there's great conflict. And the other two factors all through history have been acts of nature, droughts, floods, and pandemics. And number four is technology changing. And how they are coming together are the main forces behind this. For example, there can't be imbalances anymore in that environment.
Now, that's a pretty incredible statement right there. He goes all the way through it. I don't think that he kind of got the definitions of multilateral and unilateral correct. We are moving into a multipolar world order. There will be bilateral relationships all over the place. But unilateral means one country decides for everyone else. And because the United States has been an avatar of the global regime, much as the UK was prior to the US taking that leading role, and we're going to talk about that later, that was more unilateral. The top-down centralized control structure is unilateral. They call it multilateral, but it is effectively unilateral. There is a decision-making force at the center, and then everything moves out from there. But all the agreements are multilateral, meaning that a country like ours makes agreements with a multitude of countries like NATO or the UN or the WHO, et cetera. Those are multilateral agreements. So unilateral, one decider; bilateral, two entities decide together; multilateral, multiple entities decide together. And so he's off on there, or off on that point, I should say, to use at least better grammar. I'm not sure if it's entirely proper, but he talks about the breakdown of the world order and what that means in terms of economics, technology, and then he goes into the existential crises, as we went through the other day with that Naomi Klein and Astra Taylor article in The Guardian. They always bring those up. The globalists always bring those up. Isn't it amazing? Well, somehow we've got to be able to handle these things. This is in history. This is how these things have always been disrupted. This is how they evolve. This is what causes all the chaos. And of course, the chaos, as we have discussed numerous times recently, is the point. They want the destabilization because that erodes confidence in the decision maker, who is, in everyone's eyes at this point, Donald Trump. And if you can cause chaos, cause anxiety through these disruptions and destabilizations, you make people lose confidence in Trump, and then they begin to resist the changes being implemented en masse. And honestly, with the globalist reaction to a lot of this, it should at least make you think maybe, and we talked about this a bit on Monday too, the Great Reset narrative, as it's been described and understood by us, and myself included, for years now, it starts to really look like a fear campaign to convince people to resist the things that Donald Trump is doing. And so then it really comes down to a matter of whether or not you see Donald Trump actively resisting that program. And I personally do. You can never be 100% certain of these things. But in terms of how I view the world in the good twin, evil twin paradigm, Donald Trump, in almost everything he does, is, if not directly moving toward decentralization, he is the catalyst for narrative movements and societal understanding toward decentralization. So I have a real tough time seeing Donald Trump as the ultimate centralizer of control underneath that global regime. And people are concerned about his relationship with Israel and Zionism and the rest of it. He does not seem to be on the side of the global regime, and they don't seem to think that he is. Now, people are then like, well, this is just some grand display. This is a stage play, and Donald Trump is just their actor who's convinced everybody that it is this other way. And I don't think that's right. I don't think that makes much sense, because why would you bother waking everyone up? Why would you bother promoting someone who's a catalyst of this awakening? And you can always flip this back and forth till the end of days, but man, I don't see it. I don't know how people come down on it that way when they are actually watching what's happening in the world right now. And then the other step to it is that these changes are inevitable. They're already baked into the cake. They're already happening. So then it becomes a matter of how we respond. Let's continue with Ray Dalio.
A recession. Do you think it is likely that the United States will dip into a recession because of President Trump's tariffs?
I think that right now we are at a decision-making point and very close to a recession. And I'm worried about something worse than a recession if this isn't handled well. A recession is 2 negative quarters of GDP, and whether it goes slightly there, we always have those things. We have something that's much more profound. We have a breaking down of the monetary order. We are going to change the monetary order because we cannot spend the amounts of money, so we have that problem. And when we talk about the dollar and we talk about tariffs, we have that. We are having profound changes in our domestic order, how ruling is existing, and we're having profound changes in the world order. Such times are very much like the 1930s. I've studied history, and this repeats over and over again. So if you take tariffs, if you take debt, if you take the rising power challenging the existing power, if you take those factors and look at the factors, those changes in the orders, the systems, are very, very disruptive. How that's handled could produce something that is much worse than a recession, or it could be handled well. Let's take the debt situation.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, very quickly, because
So it's just like the 1930s. Isn't that amazing? And you know what happened after that? Nazis everywhere. And that's where they are trying to lead us back to. That's the ultimate trump card, if you will, on that side. Suggests that the entire point is to exterminate one particular group of people, and therefore everything is justified. I mean, think about how many times in our lives we've heard the question about whether or not it would be moral to kill Hitler as a baby. And it's a silly philosophical exercise, and that's fine. But it speaks to the ability to justify proactively committing heinous acts in order to prevent a potential reality. And you're able to do this while looking moral because you've convinced everyone that potential reality is really coming and that it would be worse than absolutely anything you could think to do to stop it. And that justification is being built. And I think that we can see that being built on a regular basis. And I think that that's what Ray Dalio is alluding to. This stuff sounds, and I think should sound, and probably does to most of your ears, like a threat. He's talking about the existential crises that they cause. He's talking about this narrative about the 1930s. And all of this is really just to frame what is a breakdown of the world order as he's describing it in the way they've had it since World War II. That's not a coincidence. Let's continue with Ray Dalio. Got to pull this link up. There we go. Now it's happening. It's all happening. Hold for processing.
And international conflict.
What's worst case scenario that you're warning of? To be very specific, to be very
specific, the value of money, internal conflict, that is not the normal democracy as we know it, and international conflict in a way that is highly disruptive to the world economy and could even be a military conflict, just as these breakdowns have occurred before. You know, we have a new order that began in 1945, a new monetary order and a new geopolitical order. And these go in cycles that can be measured. And I worry about the breakdown of that kind of an order, particularly since it doesn't need to happen, because there are certain things that could be done in which this is better, a better restructuring of these debts and actions taken.
So that takes me to my next question. You have this book, How Countries Go Broke, The Big Cycle. What is the solution here?
Well, there are a series of solutions, but let's take the most important.
And we have 1 minute.
1 minute. Okay. 3% of GDP, bring that deficit down. It can be done in a bipartisan way, the way it was done between 1991 and 98. I explained how that could be done, doing things together for the greater good. And then internationally on all of these issues, to use American strength, but to negotiate well, to lay out ways in which bad conflict and inefficient policies don't create great disruptions, but get us through this in an orderly way.
So that seems like he's almost bargaining there at the end, talking about internal conflicts as well. So we have the existential crises. We have the World War II scenario. We have Trump as Hitler and all of us are Nazis. And then we have potentially civil war via internal conflict. And it sounds at that point like he's basically gone through the entire regime playbook on the destabilization of nations. And he is, again, describing the breakdown of the world order based on the economic changes that are coming. This is National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett. I believe this was from, this is from Sunday, talking to Jake Tapper on how much of the world is actually already coming with Trump, with us.
The way that I would think about it is that in the previous administration, you can sort of say, if you're thinking about it in the football analogy, is that they were running out the clock. And that what's going on now in the Trump administration is across a wide array of policy areas, we're in a 2-minute offense. And the 2-minute offense is pushing, as you've seen, the reconciliation bill through so that we get tax relief for American people, deregulation, and, of course, trade policy. Now, on the trade policy, the whole point of the trade policy is to address the national emergency that we're too dependent on foreign products in the U.S., especially if we were at a time of conflict. And we're doing something about that. And the reciprocal act was basically, guys, if you come to the table and negotiate with us and treat us the same way we treat you, then we'll get your rate really low. And so right now, 130 countries have responded, and we're negotiating with them, and they've got their rate down to 10%. And so really, it's kind of almost a two-world system. There's a process about China, and that's very, very nascent, if at all. And then the process for everybody else. So the process for everybody else is orderly. It's clear. People are coming to town with great offers. We've got Japan, Korea, India. I was just talking to the foreign minister of India, and everything is moving forward very quickly. And so I guess that the bottom line is that the small business owner has experienced over the last few weeks the start of a process that's settling down really quite quickly. Again, 130 countries are at 10% now.
That's a great number. That's a lot of the world. That's pretty important. All of these countries understand they had a good enough deal, maybe not even a good deal, maybe not even a good enough deal. They had a deal with the global regime in that top-down, centralized, controlled world economy. And now they can just make another deal. And Trump's going to say, if you don't make a deal, well, this is what's going to happen. And that would potentially be crippling for many of these countries. So they're going to come to the table and they'll make a deal. And then at that point, they don't need the deal from the global regime, because the deal from the global regime was primarily helping them with the U.S. and other countries that are among those 130. And so there's a smaller handful of countries with economies and national securities that mostly depend on the United States. They don't have any leverage. The United States has leverage. Donald Trump has leverage, and he's using it effectively. This is from CNBC on Monday, a little bit more of Kevin Hassett. Trump aide Hassett says U.S. got amazing tariff deal offers. Recession 100% not happening. So not only are we not going to have worse than a recession, as Ray Dalio says, we are not even going to have a recession. Now, a recession is usually 2 quarters of decreasing economic growth. And we were told that that definition, like the definition of vaccines, was no longer applicable during the fake and illegitimate 4 years of Joe Biden. But considering that was the definition, and Ray Dalio just restated that as the definition, it doesn't sound like we're going to have that either, at least not according to Kevin Hassett. National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett said Monday that more than 10 countries have made very good or amazing trade deal offers to the United States after President Donald Trump imposed steep tariffs on imports for many nations. Hassett also said in a Fox Business interview that there is no chance at all, 100% not, that the U.S. will experience a recession in 2025. He denied there was any insider trading by Trump or White House officials ahead of the president's months-long pause in so-called reciprocal tariffs Wednesday. And of course, that's in relation to the claims by Adam Schiff and some others that Donald Trump was engaged in insider trading by posting on Truth Social. Now would be a good time to buy before the stock market shot up within an hour or so after that, maybe even faster than that. I can't remember exactly the duration there. But that was supposedly insider trading because he told people to invest, and that was going to help him in terms of his standing when it comes to these economic issues. And obviously there's the immediate gotcha of Nancy Pelosi and everybody else as far as the insider trading goes. Continuing. Trump U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick are mulling whether offers of trade pacts from other countries are good enough, Hassett said in the interview. The one question I have open in my mind is, should we go one at a time or should we announce a bundle all at once? He also said business executives have been telling him that companies are pushing to move their overseas operations back to the U.S. while consumers are buying up foreign goods because they are worried about future tariffs. So everything's through the roof anecdotally, he said, adding that recent U.S. jobs reports data is really, really good. So the Ray Dalio bit in context of this sounds like nothing more than fear-mongering. These are the people who got extraordinarily wealthy manipulating markets that were controlled. He's the manager or owner, whatever, however you say it, of the hedge fund Bridgewater Associates. I think he's worth $54 billion. Where did all that money come from? It didn't come from the multipolar world order. Definitely didn't come from that. Now, there might be intelligence behind the acquisition of all this money. You still might have to be a very competent operator to be able to do that. But you're operating within manipulated systems, and you are one of the chosen ones within that manipulated system. It's incredible that they run the world on that basis and then say things like Donald Trump is going after his political opponents. Your entire system revolves around picking winners and losers and then manipulating things on behalf of the winners to the detriment of the losers. That's the system. Madness. Let us continue. We discussed this for a little bit on Devolution Power Hour on Saturday night, but I'd be remiss not to drop it on this podcast because I think that it's important. And I think that it provides the big picture backdrop for all of these economic adjustments right now. We have been, let me try it this way. The media has displayed to us the elements of this process one by one and told us how each element of the process will fail, causing disastrous consequences for not only America and its national security, for global stability, but also for our own pocketbook. It's going to affect us negatively. The tariffs are attacks on the American consumer. We've heard these kinds of lines a number of times. They go, when there's a stock market crash, they say, this is destroying people's 401ks. When the tariffs are announced, we see stock markets go down. And then the tariffs are withdrawn. They say, well, this is causing uncertainty. That's going to make the economy crash. Every little element of the process is being framed for us as something that by itself will cause the whole thing to fail. And so they present it, let's say it's 5 elements, it's probably more than that, but they'll present each one of those elements as a catalyst for failure. And then after you get through the cycle of the presentation of each one of them that way, you think, wow, each one of these things is a catalyst for failure. Imagine what it's going to be like when they're all together. And so that's how all this has been framed. But I think what's happening, and I think it's kind of obvious once you get into it, is the implementation of what they call the Mar-a-Lago Accords. And they had a couple of articles in the middle of March on this. And this kind of just did not show up on my radar for whatever reason. I didn't pay enough attention to the Mar-a-Lago Accord. It sounds kind of like shorthand for whatever they're planning down at Trump's golf club. Because, of course, they always have to make it sound unserious, as though it wasn't the Winter White House. So this is from the Financial Times on, I believe this was, I feel like it was March 12th. I think that's what I looked up the other day, but don't quote me on that. Mar-a-Lago Accord, Schmar-a-Lago Accord, The Anatomy of a Bad Idea. Okay, so this is written by 2 writers, Steve Kamen and Mark Sobel. Kamen was previously head of international finance at the Federal Reserve, and Mark Sobel was previously head of international finance at the U.S. Treasury. So these are people well within the confines of the global banking regime. In recent weeks, the buzz has been mounting about a new American plan, Mar-a-Lago Accord, to upend the global monetary system. We can only hope it remains idle chatter. In brief, based on a detailed discussion paper by CEA Chair nominee Stephen Moran, the Accord, that's Council of Economic Advisors, the Accord would have America's trading partners help weaken the dollar and commit to providing low-cost, long-term financing to the U.S. government, enforced by the threat of higher tariffs or removal of security guarantees. Okay. That sounds kind of all right, right? Low-cost financing. We have as leverage the threat of higher tariffs because we are the economic hub of the world, and the removal of security guarantees. If countries want their security guaranteed by elements of the United States and its military, well, they're going to have to do business with us on that bilateral level, rather than continuing to align with the global regime, which is ultimately the enemy. Intriguingly, there has been no announcement by the Trump administration or even a tweet by Trump, but Moran's paper, along with various utterances by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, have led Wall Street observers to believe such an initiative is indeed in the offing. And that's too bad, because a Mar-a-Lago Accord would be pointless, ineffectual, destabilizing, and only lead to the erosion of the dollar's preeminent role in the global financial system. Again, that kind of sounds like a threat. The Mar-a-Lago Accord is premised on the view, and actually, let's just pause for a second. That threat that the dollar would no longer be the world's reserve currency. The idea is that the global banking regime is going to shift that to some other country, and give them that global reserve status, which would mean that under the same model, the United States' position as the dominant superpower would be gone and replaced by another country as the dominant superpower. And then we would very likely be looked at the way the global regime sees Russia. That would be the case if all of these other countries stayed on the model as it stands now. But it doesn't seem like all these other countries are going to stay on the model as it stands now. So with that taken into account, the threat kind of goes away. So let's continue. The Mar-a-Lago Accord is premised on the view that the dollar's global dominance is bad for America. Unnatural demand has caused gross overvaluation. And the unnatural demand, also called inelastic demand, is a product of the dollar as the global reserve currency. Everyone needs it, even if they wouldn't be using it. So the demand is higher than it would be natural. This has in turn led to reduced export competitiveness, persistent trade deficits, and the erosion of U.S. manufacturing. In response, an accord would call for the U.S. and its trading partners to intervene in foreign exchange markets to sell dollars for foreign currency in a bid to get the dollar down. However, since foreign sales of U.S. treasuries and prospects of dollar losses could push up U.S. interest rates and jeopardize the financing of federal budget deficits, foreign governments would have to increase the duration of their remaining holdings of treasuries, even buying 100-year zero-coupon bonds from the U.S. government. In essence, free financing for a century. And because they could not be expected to do this voluntarily, they would be threatened with higher tariffs or the loss of American military support if they failed to comply. So what's wrong with all that? Well, that's a good question. Why don't you tell us, servants of the global regime, servants of the regime bankers? Because all of that sounds kind of good. First, contrary to Moran's view that the dollar's global role is harmful for America, which is not exactly what he says. We'll see that in a minute. It is actually a net plus, facilitating our business activities abroad, lowering the cost of capital, and increasing our geopolitical reach. And even if the plan succeeded in lowering the dollar, it would do nothing to help the U.S. economy or its workers. Now, that is an assumption they're making that is very likely untrue. We will see in the future. But in terms of increasing our geopolitical reach, that is an admission right there that our currency status as the global reserve currency is used as a geopolitical cudgel. That is the leverage that influences other nations to do what we demand. And that's the leverage that they accept because that's the leverage that they have as the global regime bankers. America has other leverage. America, as a sovereign nation, has other leverage, and it's being described here. The potential for tariffs and the security guarantees. The global regime fiat bankers don't have those things if we are not enthralled to their system of control. Much of our trade deficits reflect a buoyant economy and large fiscal deficits, not the strong dollar. Moreover, our trade deficits aren't really a problem per se. Despite them, U.S. economic growth has outstripped that of our major trading partners, and the unemployment rate is only 4%, very low by historical standards. In fact, there's no logic to the notion that all countries should have balanced trade. We need trade deficits in order to provide an outlet for spending that otherwise would show up as economic overheating and inflation. Moreover, the strong dollar clearly isn't the cause. And by the way, inflation is the global regime fiat bankers choosing for themselves how much our money is worth. It's crazy. Moreover, the strong dollar clearly isn't the cause of the shrinking share of U.S. workers in manufacturing, now less than 10% of total employment. The same trend has been at work the world over in countries with both trade surpluses and deficits on account of the rapid productivity growth in this sector. Now, there is rapid productivity growth in manufacturing from automation and then eventually from AI and potentially robotics, et cetera. But there also has been a concerted effort by these very same people in the global regime to ship manufacturing abroad. Nobody doubts that has been part of the cause of this issue over the past 4 decades and probably much longer. That being reversed is possible. The idea here is that that can't be reversed at all. And the truth is, even if it wasn't just about providing jobs in manufacturing in the U.S., which it is partly about, it's still about the guarantee of self-sufficiency so that the United States can exist as a sovereign nation and not be under the thumb of the global regime and its fiat bankers. Second, the plan would not succeed. As countless studies have shown, pushing the dollar down on a sustained basis would require the Federal Reserve to lower rates and foreign central banks to raise rates. But with U.S. inflation stubbornly exceeding the Fed's 2% target, how did it happen? And foreign economies languishing, that's not going to happen. By the same token, if foreign governments were busy selling treasury bonds in order to depress the dollar, it's unlikely that increasing the duration of their remaining dollar bonds could be enough to keep U.S. interest rates from rising. And while threats of higher tariffs and ejection from the security umbrella might coerce Japan and Europe to play ball, China, which should be America's main concern, is going to be less willing to kowtow to Trump, which is fine because they're decoupling. Today, there were reports, which I think have been denied by the White House, but that the tariff on China is going up to 245%. Regardless, again, these sound like threats. They are telling us this is what the system will attempt to do. This is what our model produces when actions like this are taken. And so they are speaking the language of the centralized, top-down, manipulated system. This is what the result is. When X happens, Y will result. That becomes no longer true when that system is moved away from, and the parties involved are not part of that system. If they just start their own system and that system is properly fortified so that it can resist these sorts of attacks, then the control system breaks down, and eventually, over the course of time, one would expect, although you don't want to make it sound too easy because I'm sure it's not going to be easy, but that system would ultimately be removed. And that system has been around for a while, and we're going to get into some of the history of all that. Third, a Mar-a-Lago Accord risks undermining the global dominance of the dollar. That dominance is based not only on the safety and liquidity of U.S. treasuries, but also on the long-standing historic prudence of U.S. economic policymaking and its support for a stable, rules-based global trading and financial system. So that's the one world, liberal, international, rules-based order. The rules are you have to do this, 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 so that the system of control remains in place and stable, so far as we can call it stable, until and unless people of these nations decide, oh, wait, we don't want this system. And that's what's happening now. And again, Donald Trump is the catalyst for not only the United States waking up and embracing that reality, but the world over. I would suggest Donald Trump is the main catalyst for that. I want to scale that back just a bit because who knows what these forces are in Russia and China. In many ways, they seem to be ahead of us in terms of the separation and the accountability effort for these bad actors in the global regime who had wreaked so much havoc on their societies the same way the evil twin faction, the uniparty faction in the United States, the bureaucratic administrative deep state has in the United States. They might be ahead of us, and we have to allow for that possibility. Finally, an effort to force a Mar-a-Lago Accord on resistant trading partners could trigger a global financial crisis. The stock market is already in freefall on account of Trump's capricious tariff policies. Consider what would happen if Trump threatened our allies with ejection from the U.S. security umbrella, a user fee on Treasury repayments abroad, or a selective freezing of Treasury repayments altogether, as Miran has suggested in his magnum opus. And that is something we will take a look at in just a few moments. Ditto, forcing others to reprofile into 100-year zero-coupon bonds. As the safest and most liquid asset in the world, U.S. Treasury bonds are the bedrock of the global financial system. If they suddenly became less safe and less liquid, a financial panic akin to the Lehman Brothers and coronavirus meltdowns could ensue, taking the U.S. and global economies down with it. The dollar might indeed fall, but not in a way Trump would like. So the last two major financial collapses that we've experienced in 2008 and then in 2020 are going to happen again if this program is implemented. The U.S. and global economies will be toppled by this, though it doesn't seem to be working. And Donald Trump's not going to like it. And again, it's important to remember this was written a month ago. All told, a Mar-a-Lago Accord would represent huge downside risk for approximately zero upside gain. It is doubly amazing that Trump officials seem drawn to it when there is another policy that could simultaneously lower the dollar, narrow our trade deficit, reduce interest rates, and put the federal budget on a sustainable path for years to come. And here it is. Here's the solution. Cut spending, responsibly raise taxes, and reduce the fiscal deficit. Wow. So just the uniparty financial agenda at all times when people begin to worry about debt? These are the things that we are told they always have to do. And now we are hearing that the Republican establishment might be open to raising taxes on billionaires. And right here you have the Financial Times and these two writers from Treasury and the Federal Reserve offering, hey, maybe we need to, raise some taxes. Maybe we'll just collect a little more taxes. We'll cut spending a little bit here and there, right? We'll, get on board with that Doge thing a little bit. And they even mention it right here. Instead, we get Doge tariffs with a half-life of 1.5 hours, threats to our closest allies, and the trashing of America's credibility. It's going to be a long 4 years. Yes, especially for you guys. So Doge, well, that's way too far. They want to responsibly cut federal spending, responsibly raise taxes, and responsibly reduce the fiscal deficit. So they're just recommending we stick with the uniparty's agenda, and maybe we can make slight adjustments around the edges. We understand, you little people out there, that you're not so happy with how things have been going. Well, first of all, you're wrong because the orange man lied to you. But second of all, we hear your complaints, we understand your concerns, and we are prepared to make some adjustments to fix it. What we're going to do is reduce spending by a little bit. And we're going to raise your taxes, but only by a little bit. And that's just because you said you were mad about the deficits. That's going to actually reduce our national debt, or at least reduce slightly the rate at which our national debt increases, because, of course, that's what's actually going on. The Uniparty just always thinks they can sell everything they want to do. And they've been typically successful with that in the past. So I guess you figure when you have one system and it always works, that it will always work, and that you don't ever need to embrace a new system. Let me pause for just one moment. Someone in the Substack comments to my post earlier with the links is wondering how to watch it on Substack. And all you actually have to do is go right to my Substack. Just go to imyourmoderator.substack.com, and it should appear right there at the top. And if you are on the app and you follow the podcast on the app, which I guess if you're a paid subscriber, you obviously would be doing that, then it should just be easily findable within the feed. So anyhow, moving on. So I want to bring up this Mar-a-Lago Accord paper for just a moment. And we're not going to go all the way through this because it's 42 pages long and it's a lot of dense economic stuff that I'm no expert in, and that is probably too much for this podcast. And me as the translator for all of this stuff, this is a little bit above my pay grade. So this is Miran's paper. He is at Hudson Bay Capital, a user's guide to restructuring the global trading system. And I just want to go through this executive summary here on the first page. And for the introduction down here, Miran was senior strategist at Hudson Bay Capital. He serves as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Previously, Miran served as senior advisor for economic policy at the U.S. Department of Treasury, where he assisted with fiscal policy during the pandemic recession. Prior to Treasury, Dr. Miran worked for a decade as an investment professional. Dr. Miran is also an economics fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. He received a PhD in economics from Harvard and a BA from Boston University. So this isn't some guy that Trump dragged in off the street. And I think it's important to note that when we are hearing from our betters that everything happening is the worst possible thing, and that anyone considering going along with it is some kind of moron. By the way, there was also interesting news from Scott Bessent when it comes to Treasury the other day. I think this was from Monday. I want to find, I thought there was a short video. I'm not finding it now. Maybe I'll be able to nail that down later. But he talked about how Treasury has a big toolkit in terms of Treasury buybacks and whatnot if the Fed chooses not to act. So let's go to the Miran paper. He writes, the desire to reform the global trading system and put American industry on fairer ground vis-a-vis the rest of the world has been a consistent theme for President Trump for decades. We may be on the cusp of generational change in the international trade and financial systems. The root of the economic imbalances lies in persistent dollar overvaluation that prevents the balancing of international trade. And this overvaluation is driven by inelastic demand for reserve assets. As global GDP grows, it becomes increasingly burdensome for the U.S. to finance the provision of reserve assets and the defense umbrella, as the manufacturing and tradable sectors bear the brunt of the costs, and also, of course, the globalization. In this essay, I attempt to catalog some of the available tools for reshaping these systems, the trade-offs that accompany the use of these tools, and policy options for minimizing side effects. This is not policy advocacy, but an attempt to understand the financial market consequences of potential significant changes in trade or financial policy. Tariffs provide revenue, and if offset by currency adjustments, present minimal inflationary or otherwise adverse side effects. So why don't they tell us about the other part, by the way, the offset in currency adjustments? Because you want to talk about each of these things individually, which is actually what that article just did. It broke them down. Here's the one thing. Here's the other thing. Here's the other thing. We're going to tell you how each of these things individually is going to cause a collapse and a failure within this system that we've built. Okay. And all of those things collectively, which is what they ignore, is a departure from that system. So the rules of the system no longer apply. And we kind of talked about this a bit in terms of thought paradigms last week on the subscriber stream. While currency offset can inhibit adjustments to trade flows, It suggests that tariffs are ultimately financed by the tariffed nation, whose real purchasing power and wealth decline, and that the revenue raised improves burden sharing for reserve asset provision. Tariffs will likely be implemented in a manner deeply intertwined with national security concerns, and I discuss a variety of possible implementation schemes. I also discuss optimal tariff rates in the context of the rest of the U.S. taxation system. Currency policy aimed at correcting the undervaluation of other nations' currencies brings an entirely different set of trade-offs and political implications. Historically, the United States has pursued multilateral approaches to currency adjustments. And of course, multilateral is all we could pursue because it's the top-down control system of the global regime and its fiat bankers that are ultimately making those decisions. And they might have their branches in the United States and these other nations, and they get together and they say, okay, this is what it's going to be. But that's from the top-down centralizing authority. That's why the multilateral agreement is required. In a multipolar, sovereign, nationalist-oriented world order where countries are looking out for themselves and forming bilateral relationships, this isn't the system. I describe some potential avenues for both multilateral and unilateral currency adjustment strategies, as well as means of mitigating unwanted side effects. And the currency control would be unilateral. Finally, I discuss a variety. The tariff thing would be bilateral. Finally, I discuss a variety of financial market consequences of these policy tools and possible sequencing. And so Miran writes a 42-page paper laying out the high-level theory, his thesis on why, if this is approached in a certain way, it's not only going to work, but it's going to work without destabilizing any of the things that are threatened to be destabilized. And so we have the presentation from regime media and its mouthpieces at the Financial Times in the expert class, telling us why each element won't work, and therefore the collective whole will definitely not work. Not only should you be scared one time about the collective whole, you should be scared 5 times about its individual pieces. It's an incredible communication strategy that has always worked. This is the Atlantic Council in their freak out. I mean, who's more globalist than the Atlantic Council? And we're going to see in actually just a second. But they're way up there at the top. Meeting in Mar-a-Lago. Is a new currency deal plausible? This was March 13th. And I just want to hit 2 spots in this. How will this different constellation impact any potential negotiation? It makes a deal much more complicated. And so complicated should be a fear factor. Miran and others want to use tariffs to get countries to the negotiation table. If these countries are worried enough about the cost of tariffs, Miran thinks they will be willing to make major changes to their currencies that they'd never otherwise consider. But Miran doesn't stop there. He knows tariffs alone aren't enough of a stick. So he thinks it is time to put the U.S. security umbrella up for debate. So tariffs and security as leverage. Miran argues that the security zone should be financed by the beneficiaries, and this can be leveraged to both depreciate the dollar and to mitigate the inflation effect of tariffs. And the counter-argument, the opposite position, would be that the security zone should be financed by the people providing the security. And we're told that's how it has to work because we are economically dependent on these other countries, and this is how the global order operates. So it's really just, no, we need our system. Countries in the security zone should, quote, fund it by buying treasuries, end quote, especially century bonds, those being the zero rate 100-year bonds. And unless you swap your bills for bonds, tariffs will keep you out. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has also discussed the idea that countries can enjoy shared defense as long as there are shared currency goals, while tariffs can be used for negotiation of terms. This administration seems at least open to the idea of linking the U.S. security umbrella with the restructuring of the global trade system to benefit the United States. Okay, why shouldn't they be? Skipping down toward the end, the Japanification of China. The Plaza Accord forever altered the trajectory of Japan's economy. The appreciation of the Japanese yen contributed to bursting Tokyo's asset bubble and the lost decades of economic stagnation. At least that is the lingering impression of the 1985 currency agreement in China. There are certain similarities between Japan's economic slowdown in the 90s and the one that China is currently experiencing, such as deflation, low consumer demand, and capital flight. Well, low consumer demand is going to happen whenever nations decouple, because you don't have the consumer base elsewhere. In January, China's 30-year government bond fell below that of Japan's for the first time, and over the weekend, China's inflation dropped below zero again. China is willing to go to lengths to avoid a Japanification of its own economy, including refusing to appreciate the renminbi against the dollar, even if it means weathering a protracted trade war. And so that is very interesting. China is going to refuse to manipulate its currency on behalf of the global regime, the threat being the Japanification of China. And they might do that even if it means engaging in this protracted trade war. China has previously raised concerns about the U.S. dollar's role as the dominant reserve currency and wouldn't necessarily complain if the dollar's preferential position in foreign reserves and global finance weakened. But with persistently sluggish consumer demand, China is still counting on the export sector to help drive economic growth in 2025. Beijing won't want to risk any changes to the renminbi that would decrease the competitiveness of its exports in the midst of a trade war. So they're not going to do the bad thing. The idea of a Mar-a-Lago Accord is going to appeal to Trump. After all, he was the man who bought the Plaza Hotel in 1988, right after the famous agreement. But getting there is going to require more than just tariffs and a threat to remove security guarantees. China is going to have to see what's in it for them, and that, so far, remains a mystery. Well, does it? Or are you just describing it that way because China seems to have an agenda and a plan and know what it's doing? And so we have two writers here, one from who was a former advisor to the International Monetary Fund, and both of them on the Atlantic Council Geoeconomics Center. Members of that organization, I should say. And let's look at one more piece of regime-oriented freakout. This is actually very reasonable sounding freakout. She's like, well, I don't know what's going to happen, but hopefully it'll be okay by the end. So this is a lady from the even more globalist Council on Foreign Relations.
Accord is a set of economic policy proposals you're not going to want to ignore. Most people think of Mar-a-Lago as U.S. President Trump's Florida home, but increasingly in financial markets, Mar-a-Lago means something else, the Mar-a-Lago Accord. It's a series of policy proposals put forward by Stephen Miran, the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. The goal of the Accord is to support U.S. manufacturing, and if it is implemented, it could mark the biggest change in global bond and currency markets that we've seen since the 1980s. I'm Rebecca Patterson, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. I've also been a global investor and economic researcher for nearly 30 years. The Mar-a-Lago Accord can really be thought of as 5 basic steps. Step 1 is tariffs. helping manufacturers in the U.S. by making them more competitive compared to imports. That's well underway. Step 2 is combining trade and tariffs with defense. If foreign countries want to stay under the U.S. security umbrella, they have to pay for it, maybe with tariffs, with major investments in the U.S., or other actions. Step 3 is keeping the dollar the global reserve currency, but weakening it at the same time. President Trump knows that a global reserve currency gives the United States geopolitical leverage. At the same time, a weaker dollar can support exports, and that helps manufacturing. So how to get there? One idea in the Mar-a-Lago Accord is to have foreign governments switch some of its current Treasury holdings into much longer duration bonds. Now, Step 4 is a fix if Step 3 can't move forward, and that's basically the United States acting unilaterally to weaken the dollar, directly buying foreign currencies, or perhaps considering something like a tax on foreign capital inflows to the United States. Step 5 is the Federal Reserve, really supporting these policies and intervening if needed. First, of course, is the bond market. Swapping Treasury holdings into less liquid, much longer-term bonds could create volatility that would ripple through financial markets and potentially slow economic growth. Similarly with the dollar, back in 1985, when countries came together at the Plaza Accord to weaken the dollar, it went too far. It was disorderly, and they had to intervene again in 1987 to stabilize things. We could see a repeat of that. And then finally, more structurally, my worry would be that if these policies are pursued, it could slow foreign investment into the United States. It could raise interest rates in a sustained way that would affect borrowing costs for households and businesses. And potentially, it could raise questions about the Federal Reserve's independence. Both political parties today agree on supporting the U.S. manufacturing sector, and all politicians know that policies come with costs and benefits. I think the question with the Mar-a-Lago Accord is whether this set of policies is going to have enough benefits to justify the potential costs.
And so she laid it out there in the 5 steps, and the last one, of course, is the Fed doing something. If the Fed refuses to do something, what's going to happen? And I think that this is going to be the most interesting part. So Bessent says that he's got plenty of options. The financial options are going to be fine. Everything's going to be just fine. But in terms of how this plays out in the public, then we're going to have potentially a situation where Donald Trump has to remove Jerome Powell from the Fed. And that will bring up 2 conversations. One, independent agencies. Is the Fed independent? We're told it's independent. It's nonpartisan. That makes it sound like it's fair. It's just doing the best for everyone. It's not influenced by politics, but of course it is. It's all part of the same system as our uniparty politics. And so we have that issue, which is already coming up all across the government. And then we have the exposure element where the American public begins learning, by and large, that actually the Federal Reserve and the IRS are not parts of the federal government in the way that we think they are. They're actually just kind of the bagmen and the collection arm for the global regime fiat bankers. And once we get to that point, we have made significant progress, I think, as a culture in understanding the state of our reality in a way that we had not prior. So I think all of that is extremely important. And I would suspect that over the coming months, we are probably going to get down to the real critical moments in that process. And I think the Fed, let me actually ask the machine, when is Powell next considering rate reductions? I think it's in early May, but I could be wrong about that. May 7th is the next meeting. Okay. Nailed it. Whatever. Remembering dates. It's got to be really smart to remember dates. The Guardian. So let's go back big picture, pulling out from the focus on the economics back to the collapse of this world order. And this is the Guardian from Saturday. I can't believe I'm using Guardian articles twice in the same week, but you got to love it when they're covering the real thing in the most freaking out way. The headline is, "The New World Order of the past 35 years is being demolished before our eyes. This is how we must proceed." And this is written by Gordon Brown, who's a former Prime Minister of the UK. After a week that started with the worst financial volatility in recent history and ended with the most serious escalation so far of the U.S.-China conflict, it is time to distinguish the tectonic shifts from the tremors. If nothing changes, the 2020 risks being remembered as the 2020s risks being remembered, strange, as this century's devil's decade, the term historians once used for the 1930s. It will be defined not just by 7 million people who have died of COVID-19 and rising global poverty and inequality. Wow, 7 million people, huh? But also by a dismembered Ukraine, a burnt-out Gaza, and little reported atrocities in Africa and Asia, each testimony to the violent displacement of a rules-based global order by a power-based one. Okay? So they are not the oppressive regime. They are the regime that is resisting the oppression of these powerful nations that don't want to be part of their system. Indeed, right before our eyes, every single pillar of the old order is under assault. Not just free trade, but the rule of law and the primacy we have long attached to human rights and democracy. The rule of law, human rights, and democracy. Okay. The self-determination of peoples and multilateral cooperation between nations, including the humanitarian and environmental responsibilities we once accepted as citizens of the world. Total inversion within the false reality on each level of what he just said. And, you know, we could spend an hour just talking about the inversions of each one of those elements. Power shifts are, of course, the stuff of history. Within the space of 2 centuries, 4 world orders have risen and fallen. The first 2, the balance of power that emerged after the defeat of Napoleon in the early 19th century, and the post-1918 Treaty of Versailles system, born after 4 dynastic empires collapsed, ultimately ended in the carnage of world wars. Then came the post-1945 architecture, led by the U.S. and the UN, and after 1990, with the breakup of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, what U.S. President George H.W. Bush called a New World Order. Now that I know is a conspiracy theory, and I know that this is a regime-oriented former prime minister of the UK, but you got to understand that it's only a conspiracy theory if you think it's bad. Okay, if you think it's good that there's a new world order that was implemented after the breakup of the Soviet Union, then it's not a conspiracy theory. Yeah, of course there's a new world order, exactly as we designed it. We don't want countries like the Soviet Union to exist because they're not on board with our system. They have their system, and these satellite states around their system as part of that system. We don't want anything like that. We can't have anything like that. That's why we wage war across the entire face of the earth, to make sure that countries will be part of our world order. So it's only a conspiracy theory if you think it's bad. Now, as the economic balance of power shifts eastward and a new mercantilism takes root, what was once called the Washington Consensus is no longer supported anywhere, least of all in Washington. Globalization is now rejected by millions as a free-for-all that has not been fair to all. I don't even know that I would call it a free-for-all. It is an entirely controlled system. It is not open trade, but the opposite. Restrictions on trade now being popularized as a nation's route to prosperity. What are the rules in the rules-based order, if not governing how trade functions? That's the definition of restrictions on trade. This is the definition of free markets. In the free market, one side negotiates with the other side, and then they make a deal and decide to do business. Or if they can't make a deal, they don't do business. That's a free market. A rules-based order with a top-down centralized control over the world economy, that's restriction on trade. Total inversion within the false reality. Every element, and when I say that, I mean every element that you can detect is itself the polar opposite, okay? So if the system has 10 elements, you take each one of those elements, figure out the polar opposite, see if that's represented collectively in another system, and then you have total inversion. President Trump's tactical ploy has been to exploit the profound shifts that were already reshaping the world's geopolitics. First, the yawning gap between the benefits that globalization promised and what it delivered in people's everyday lives. And so he has become the world's leading anti-globalist. Wonderful. Unless he's just tricking us. He also saw how, turbocharged by social media blitzes landing nonstop via people's phones, he could resurrect the great man theory of history. Putin, Xi, Erdogan, and Kim Jong-un having shown him that populist but dictatorial leaders could set the agenda. Well, we're just going to have to take your word for it, that they're dictatorial. They're dictatorial in the view of people like this who want everything in the world controlled from that top-down centralized authority, which is why they have the United Nations, why they have the World Economic Forum, why they have the World Health Organization and the World Trade Organization. How can you have free trade in a World Trade Organization that, in the title, organizes world trade? You got to love the list of dictators here, too. For real. They could have added Orban and Mohammed bin Salman, just kept going. But Trump's sheer unpredictability foreshadows even greater danger ahead. Let chaos reign and don't reign in the chaos. Chaos again. Seems to be the mantra. And while there may be a lingering hope that something like normal governance might resume soon, this can no longer be a rational basis for anyone's future planning. That's quite a warning to his allies. Instead, with both the U.S. and China taking risks and accelerating their confrontation to new levels, the question is whether we are descending toward a one world, two systems future, or simply the chaotic disorder that has characterized the history of most previous centuries, and whether there is now any chance of building a world order that could ever be stable and sustainable. Well, the answer was obviously no, unless it was all going to be that borders were going to be erased. Everything was going to be governed by a very, very tiny elite, 300 people, 3,000, 300,000 people out of what we're told is 8 billion controlling everything. Pass. So, one world, two systems. Is that what we're doing? Probably not. It's going to be a multipolar world order. And the system is every country makes deals with every other country that they want to make deals with. What's clear after recent events is that the fourth global order cannot be restored. Fourth Reich? What is the fourth global order? I mean, I know it's in context of what he was talking about before, Napoleon, post-Versailles, post-World War II. I get it. We are not only in a more post-Soviet Union would be the fourth. We are not only in a more protectionist era, but are moving from a unipolar world where the U.S. was the sole hegemonic power to one that has many more centers of decision-making power. Yes. Congratulations, Gordon. You've got it. But because we are also a more interconnected world, we are more vulnerable to crises, from pandemics and climate emergencies to financial contagion. All the more so because countries can, as we saw this week, weaponize that independence and the choke points it creates for their own advantage. So if we are to have anything approaching a values-based order, we will have at some point to agree an updated, this language is very strange. Maybe it's just because he's British. Or maybe I'm retarded. I don't know. To agree to, I would think, an updated global charter for our common future, something that builds on the Atlantic Charter of 1941 and the UN Charter of 1945, but is geared to a completely different century. So offering, once again, as we've seen many times now, like, okay, we get it, but can we at least make a deal with us in it? And I'm speaking on behalf of, speaking through this mouthpiece of the global regime from that perspective. They want to be included. They want a system that they get final say over. They're like, okay, well, you don't like this system, fine. We'll think of a different system, but we still need to have the same say that we used to have because we're the bankers. Of course we have to have that. As William Beveridge said at the time, a revolutionary moment in the world's history is a time for revolutions, not for patching. Over the past few days, calls for multilateral cooperation have come from the leaders of Spain, Brazil, and South Africa. Well, Brazil has basically a Joe Biden parallel pretending to be president there, so who gives a shit? South Africa and Brazil, by the way, are both already part of the BRICS coalition, so that's never going to work out, no matter how much they try to commit genocide and spark civil war in South Africa. And then Spain has a feckless leader, and that doesn't really matter. This year's chairs of 3 global conferences, Spain, Brazil, South Africa, the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, the 30th UN Climate Change Conference, and the G20. Well, here's the thing. Those conferences don't matter at all. I don't even think the U.S. is planning on going. I think Trump has suggested that these G organizations, these international organizations, shouldn't even be led by the same selection of countries. So are they going to even attend? I kind of doubt it. But we'll see. As a collective, we must now unite to enforce international law. The Malaysian Prime Minister and Colombian and South African presidents have written. The choice is stark. Either we act together to enforce international law or we risk its collapse. And the enforcement mechanism for international law has always been the United States military and NATO and UN peacekeeping forces. So they want to wage war on countries around the world and arrest leaders of nations. That's what enforcing international law means. In order to keep the rules-based order in place. And they believe that they have the right to do that. And they're trying to at least convince the people that, yes, you actually do need us to do this. So even though we don't actually have the right to do it, and we don't have the ability to do it unless the people are all on our side, you really should empower us, because otherwise this whole thing's going to fall apart. Let's keep going. All countries that believe in international cooperation should pledge that through new multilateralism, this generation will deliver global solutions to what are now inescapably global problems. Ah, yes. And once again, we are back at the existential crises. And we're going to see them in just a moment. So inescapably global problems that cannot be resolved by nation states acting on their own or in bilateral deals alone. Second, as building blocks of that future, this coalition of the willing should immediately engage in practical cooperation on urgent concerns for which no nation state only answers are possible. Global security, not a real thing. Climate, bullshit. Health and humanitarian needs, that's pandemics, bullshit. As well as the flow of trade. That's going to work just fine. They should work to modernize the international institutions that deliver them. And third, we should try to build a bridgehead to skeptics such as Trump by agreeing with him on the need for reciprocity and for fair burden sharing between nations. And because this is a debt-laden world, we should propose innovative and equitable ways to raise the resources needed to turn these commitments into action. By addressing the failures of the era of hyperglobalization, we can all strive for a world that is not only open to trade, but inclusive of all those who have been left behind. 200 years ago, in similarly momentous times, a British leader called, quote, a new world into existence to redress the balance of the old. And the lesson of history is that any new order that endures has to be built on the solid rock of principle and not the shifting sands of expediency and the narrowest interpretation of national interests. And sorry, Gordon, I don't think it's going to work out that way. You notice he also swapped in values-based order for rules-based order, while also talking about the rule of law. And what is the conflation of values, morals, with the rule of law? Are there any belief systems that believe to be moral is to obey the law? Yes, there are. And it's worth examining those belief systems and their effect on global control in this particular world order. At the heart of the Atlantic Charter, the Roosevelt-inspired Declaration of International Cooperation was a set of principles celebrating basic freedoms against the use of force and protectionism, and for the self-determination of nations and national social contracts that would bridge the divide between rich and poor. If none of these goals are, as of now, championed by Trump, all is not lost. According to the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, 82% of Americans oppose isolationism, believing that the U.S. is stronger when engaged in the world. Now, polls are fake. Polls from globalist organizations measuring anti-globalist sentiment are especially fake, but even if we were to take that number as true, which it's not, give it 6 months and we'll see what the numbers actually are, what the public sentiment reflects, because the public sentiment on display all the time in numerous indirect ways that are more accurate and more visible and more trustworthy than these ridiculous polls prove that the people are behind Trump on all of this stuff across the board. Closing this out. And while the U.S. can no longer lead a unipolar world by dictating to others, it can lead a multipolar world through persuasion. Okay, that's what Trump is doing. Sadly, despite Keir Starmer's valiant efforts, none of us can now guarantee that Ukraine and its resources will not be carved apart, emboldening autocrats everywhere. I mean, think of the implications of that. If they're not able to hold on to Ukraine, that means that none of these other regime proxy states can be held by the regime if the superstate next to it decides to repossess that proxy state. And so we're talking about Taiwan, we're talking about Guyana, we're talking about South Korea, etc. But we can set out the moral compass that will guide us and make us better prepared for the challenges ahead. We remain at risk of repeating the 1930s descent into global anarchy. But by nations acting together, we could create a 1940s moment as we start on the Herculean task of constructing the fifth world order of modern times. And the question is, do you want Gordon Brown and his pals to create and implement the next world order? In going through this the other day, I thought of Empire of the City, and some of you are probably quite familiar with this book. I think it is a worthwhile read for everyone. It's not a terribly long read. This book is from 1946. It's written by E.C., Knuth, K-N-U-T-H. And this is what the machine says as a summary. This book presents a controversial thesis that a powerful financial and political organization operates from a small area of London known as the City, referring to the City of London, the historic financial district. The author, E.C. Knuth, argues that this entity functions as a super government with influence over global finance and politics. The book claims to offer a behind-the-scenes look at the secretive international policies of the British government and posits that the City of London sits at the apex of a vast secret world order that has shaped major world events. So that would be the British Crown, the regime bankers in the City of London, operating out of the City of London. And of course, there's some disbursement, but that's primarily it. And this goes into the families that run the world and the various levels of secret societies and global government apparatus and all of that. And I think all that stuff's hugely important. And so I recalled last year, when I was reading this, posting a bunch of excerpts on my Telegram feed. And I went back through that today and I shared these today. So if you'd like to find them, you can just go to t.me/very reasonable. That'll bring you to Telegram. And then just use the search feature, Empire of the City, in my channel. You will find these, or just scroll backward if you're, watching this today. If you're watching it in the future, that's not going to be very functional. But let's go through a few of these because I think it's so interesting. I'm just going to go through these excerpts and probably not try to spend a ton of time on this, but I just kind of want to introduce some of these concepts to people. Again, this is written in 1946. So this is how things were perceived at that time. We can be told, I'm 46. So my elementary school education, my high school education, my college education was from 1983 through 2000, all right? In that time, I learned that this period was a certain way. And of course, our culture teaches us that this period was a certain way. And that culture is constantly reproduced. We constantly get these references to that era. And when they make the references, they explain how that era was and frame it in a certain way so that it is effective in its propagandistic effect right now. So the history is written and rewritten over time, constantly revised. It's wonderful to go back and see what people thought at that time, because we have the official history, the official central narrative history. We have the official counter narrative histories. And then we have this other stuff that exists outside the controlled opposition dynamic. And that is where we ultimately get the truth. Now, the official narrative history can be quite informative because you have to understand the motivation and you can unpack the motivations relative through the lens of what we see happening now. When you hear about historical atrocities, you can consider that while you can't just deny that they happened out of hand, you can at least understand that there is justification for doubting them because we were told that white Americans were committing grave atrocities against black Americans throughout our entire lives. And that's clearly not happening. Now, I'm not saying nobody's racist, and I'm not saying nobody does bad things, and I'm not saying no cop ever does a bad thing, okay? But the idea that there is some white supremacist, mass violence against black Americans is insane. And so we have that lens to go back and look through some of the history and try to understand it. So let's get into this. And I'm just going to hit the excerpts quickly and hopefully not get too bogged down in weighing in. But I took a bunch of highlights, and I think they're worth just giving some of the ideas of this book. As developed herein from many aspects and from many authoritative sources, the functions of the British Parliament are restricted largely to the local and domestic affairs of Great Britain itself and the parliaments of 4 dominions of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the Union of South Africa are likewise confined to similar functions in their own countries. How about that? Look at that British Commonwealth. It's amazing. Skipping ahead. This tiny area of a little over 1 square mile, this being the City of London, has in it the giant Bank of England, a privately owned institution, which, as is further elaborated hereinafter, is not subject to regulation by the British Parliament and is in effect a sovereign world power. Within the city are located also the stock exchange and many institutions of worldwide scope. Kind of sounds like Washington, D.C. and New York, doesn't it? The city carries on its business of local government with a fanciful display of pompous medieval ceremony and with its officers attired in grotesque ancient costumes. And let me actually pull this up. Officers of the British Crown in the city of London. Yes, they have quite the costumes. Come on. Hold for processing. Why is this so difficult? Anyhow, it keeps pulling up just, I would have to do a more elaborate search for this. There's a documentary on all this that has the costumes. It's ridiculous stripes and ruffles and frills, and it's very gay. Kind of what you would expect. All right, so let's get back to this. So in the city, the city is not subject to the rule of the British Parliament, Washington, D.C. They have their own government structure, their own independent, privately owned banking institution, like the Fed, and they have the stock exchange there as well. And so they have full control over that. And we've got that in New York, and we are continuously throughout our lives led to believe that the government controls all these things for the best interest of the American people who elect these people. None of those elements are true. None of them. We don't elect them. They don't operate on our behalf, and they don't have control over the Federal Reserve Bank, the taxing system, any of the elements of the global regime. And of course, the stock market is just one element in the control structure of the world economy. All you have to do is be able to manipulate markets, and you can essentially extract money from the people anytime you want, and with any advance notice, push all that money to people like Ray Dalio. Let's continue. All this trivial pomp and absurdity and horseplay seems to serve very well to blind the eyes of the public to the big things going on behind the scenes. That the British people and the British Parliament have little to say in the foreign affairs of the British Empire, and that the people of the British Empire must fight when international finance and the city blow the trumpet. This is the most pernicious, palpable effect flowing from the monarchical theory, for these men do this in the king's name, who is in theory still a real monarch, although in reality only a convenient puppet to be used by the cabinet at pleasure to suit their own ends. So consider what we've been told about the British royalty. And of course, the British royalty, the monarchy, was taken over by Prussians centuries ago. And this is part of the Prussian banking system. And the Prussiagate series does a great job on a lot of this stuff leading into this situation. And I would, again, recommend that highly to everyone. But when I talk about how King Charles isn't a real king, and we just have a reality show on display, and yet, despite the fact that they have no legitimacy and are essentially just soap opera actors as an avatar of a government, they still exercise power that is still one of the avenues for the exercise of power of the crown. Continuing. The laws of England by the Earl of Halsbury, recurrent Lord High Chancellor of Great Britain between the years 1885 and 1905, published in 1909, a massive work of over 30 huge volumes, states in volume 21, page 618, note K, there is no rule of law which compels a ministry which has lost the confidence of the House of Commons to resign office. In volume 6, the Crown is therefore a necessary party to legislation, and neither House of Parliament whether acting alone or in conjunction with the other house, has a power of legislation without the crown. The sovereign is regarded in law as being incapable of thinking wrong or meaning to do an improper act, apart from legislative authority, which is vested in the parliament, subject to certain concurrent rights of the crown. The law of the Constitution clothes the person of the sovereign with supreme sovereignty and preeminence, so they can do absolutely whatever they want. It is clear from the above that the representatives of the people in the House of Commons and the House of Lords are utterly lacking any legislative initiative, and that their function in such matters subject to certain concurrent rights of the crown is largely one of silent submission. And this is in accord with the conclusions of Professor George Burton Adams. It clearly appears that while the sovereign and the mythical crown are not one, the virtues and authorities ostensibly vested in the person of the sovereign, that being the king or the queen, pertain with the full weight as to the crown, and an act of the crown is not subject to question in the parliament, as the king can do no wrong. This provides the ideal machinery of government for the absolute rule of the crown and the world dictatorship of international finance of the city. And the nature of this structure of government is further evident in this passage from the Encyclopedia Americana: the crown as chief partner in the Jewish money lending business to secure its share of the gains. I mean, you're not allowed to say that stuff. Everybody knows that. I mean, it's definitely also not true. Okay? Remember how I said all this stuff was a conspiracy theory before? I mean, do people in the world know these things to be true at various times in history? It's just their opinion. It's just their anti-Semitism coming out at the time. It's not a condemnation of Jews to understand that it also is like this. Hold on for just a moment. I think I may have lost one of my highlighted pages. I want to be sure that I get it back because it is introductory to the post immediately following. Here we are. The hold for processing is over. The balance of power is a creation of this financial oligarchy, and its purposes are as follows. 1, to divide the nations of Europe into two antagonistic camps of nearly equal military weight, so as to retain for Britain itself the power to sway a decision either way. 2, to make the leading and potentially most dangerous military power the particular prey of British suppression, and to have the second strongest power on the other side, to subsidize the most favored nations with financial investments and to permit them to acquire political advantages under the beneficent protection of the sea power, to the disadvantage and at the expense of the nations being suppressed. What is the sea power? Well, the British Navy and the United States Navy. What have we talked about in terms of trade routes? All the way up and around Canada and Alaska and Greenland, all the way down through the Panama Canal. Shipping routes in the sea, especially around the North Pole. China and Russia involved? Probably. Seems like Donald Trump is telling us that they're involved. When he talks about China at the Panama Canal, we're going to get the Panama Canal back from China without war. We're going to take Greenland from Europe. We're going to take Canada from the Commonwealth. It's just going to work out. Trade routes. Goes all the way back to this period. Same exact thing, as we've talked about a number of times. Here it is again in a different example. Number 3, to subject the continent of Europe to the policy of encirclement, so as to keep the nations of the continent in poverty and ineffectiveness, and thereby prevent the growth of sufficient commercial expansion and wealth to create a rival sea power. To retain that complete control and hegemony over all the seas of the world, which was acquired by defeating the Allied fleets of its only real rivals, France and Spain, in 1805, and which is artfully and subtly called the freedom of the seas. And artfully and subtly there, I would think by that he means an inversion. That is an inverted term. The freedom of the seas is actually the total control of the seas by the regime power. Number 5, to shift this balance of power as required so as to be able to strike down friend or foe in the rapidly shifting scene of world power politics, in that inexorable ideology that demands that everything and anything must be sacrificed, where the future welfare and expansion to the eventual destiny of the empire are effected. That eventual destiny outlined by its proponents as the eventual control of all the lands and all the peoples of all the world. This guy is quite a conspiracy theorist. Where does he come up with this stuff? It's crazy, isn't it? I hope you cannot hear my dog snoring, but if you can, I guess it's probably kind of funny. He is snoring up a storm over on the floor right now. And hey, he's a little old man, so he's allowed to do it. Few more here. The ideology of the British Empire has been outlined in the past by various British statesmen, and specifically by Mr. Disraeli, Lord Beaconsfield. 2 names, Mr. Disraeli, who is referred to in the aristocracy as Lord Beaconsfield. The modern version, which has been broadened to include the United States as a principal in the British Empire, was outlined by Cecil Rhodes about 1895 as follows. And by the way, Cecil Rhodes, that's the namesake of the Rhodes Scholarship. Bill Clinton, Rhodes Scholar. Rachel Maddow, Rhodes Scholar. Susan Rice, Rhodes Scholar. Jacinda Ardern, Rhodes Scholar. Naomi Wolf, Rhodes Scholar. Establish a secret society in order to have the whole continent of South America, the Holy Land, the Valley of the Euphrates, the islands of Cyprus and Candia, the islands of the Pacific not heretofore possessed by Great Britain, the Malay Archipelago, the seaboard of China and Japan, and finally, the United States. In the end, Great Britain is to establish a power so overwhelming that wars must cease and the millennium be realized. There it is. The system of control. If we want world peace, it's got to be controlled by that one entity. And of course, it's going to be them. They control the money. And for anyone who buys into the monetary system, well, you give someone enough money, they're going to do pretty much anything you want them to do. The fallibility of human nature. Let us continue. As long as I don't keep messing up. Here we are. It appears the organizations such as Union Now, subversive to the liberty and the Constitution of the United States of America, have a large sprinkling of Rhodes Scholars among their staff. And he's talking about the Pilgrim Society of Great Britain and how it came into the Pilgrim Society of the United States, which I'm pretty sure still exists today. In fact, let's just go to Wiki because I know that I've looked this up on the podcast before. Where are we here? Pilgrim Society. Yes, founded in 1902 by Sir Harry Britton, a British-American society established, in the words of American diplomat Joseph Choate, who is still the namesake of a very prominent private school, to promote goodwill, good fellowship, and everlasting peace between the United States and Great Britain. So we have the special relationship here run by these secret societies, and they go through various members and the history. Notable members, the Queens, Queen Elizabeth, King Charles, Walter Cronkite. Let's see if Alan Dulles, John Foster Dulles, General Alexander Haig, Henry Luce, who we've talked about on the podcast before, Henry Kissinger, Donald Rumsfeld, John D. Rockefeller, David Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller, Jacob Schiff, the banker, Secretary of State Cyrus Vance, Margaret Thatcher, Paul and Felix Warburg, and former CIA Director James Woolsey. Really interesting, isn't it? Let's continue with Empire. Mr. Winston Churchill concluded this project had reached such momentum that he could afford to extend to it his blessing in these well-chosen words. These two great organizations of the English-speaking democracies, the British Empire and the United States, will have to be somewhat mixed up together in some of their affairs for mutual and general advantage. For my part, looking out to the future, I do not view the process with any misgivings. I could not stop it if I wished. No one could stop it. Like the Mississippi, it just keeps rolling along. Let it roll. Let it roll on in full flood, inexorable, irresistible, benignant, to broader lands and better days. Who was Winston Churchill serving? Turns out it's the global bankers. It's discussed actually pretty well at length in this here book. A couple more left. Those who have felt surprise at the total disregard or open contempt displayed by the aristocracy and plutocracy of this land for infringements of the liberties of the subject and for abrogation of constitutional rights and usages have not taken sufficiently into account the steady influx of this poison of irresponsible autocracy from our unfree, intolerant, aggressive empire. And this was from Simon Haxey in England's Money Lords, Tory MP, published 1939. Or sorry, that's about Haxey, quoting Mr. Hobson. Should have just read that first paragraph. Two more. I said a couple, but I lied. What part do the colonial peoples play in the battle for democracy when they themselves have no democratic rights and the British governing class refuses to grant such rights? The pretended defense of democracy by the British Conservative Party can only be regarded by the colonial peoples as a monstrous piece of hypocrisy. If Britain, under a conservative government, gets into difficulties, we can be quite sure that the colonial peoples will refuse to help us, and wherever they feel strong enough, will seize power from the British governing class. The whole empire is becoming tremendously unstable, and any great shock is certain to put an end to a situation where the businessmen of one small island rule over a great part of the world. And so they shifted that power center to the United States and then essentially said, these aren't our colonies anymore. These are independent republics in the Commonwealth. You know what else was an independent republic in the Commonwealth? The USA. Just saying. Last one. The late Vincent Cartwright Vickers stated, financiers in reality took upon themselves, perhaps not the responsibility, but certainly the power of controlling the markets of the world and therefore the numerous relationships between one nation and another, involving international friendships or mistrusts. Loans to foreign countries are organized and arranged by the City of London, with no thought whatsoever of one nation's welfare, but solely in order to increase indebtedness upon which the city thrives and grows rich. This national and mainly international dictatorship of money, which plays off one country against another, and which, through ownership of a large portion of the press, converts the advertisements of its own private opinion into a semblance of general public opinion, cannot for much longer be permitted to render democratic government a mere nickname. Today we see through a glass darkly, for there is so much which it would not be in the public interest to divulge. How much has changed? They've shifted the location, and they have propagandized us so thoroughly that we are proud to support even that part of our nation's identity. That is the uniparty structure. That is the global regime structure. That is the evil twin faction. All they did was move the evil twin after World War II. They didn't defeat the evil twin. They just moved it. Steve Bannon actually alluded to this briefly today, and maybe we will, I think we'll probably wrap up here. And I see some rants. I'll get to those before we split and take a look at the chat, which I haven't really spent much time doing. But here is Steve Bannon from War Room this morning, and you'll just hear him mention the city of London.
Why is Harvard? Why is Harvard? Why Columbia? Why are they all collapsing? The $9 billion of your money at the public trough that their snouts right in. Hell, Harvard's got a $52 billion endowment. Why don't you use that? Can't touch that. Got that government money. You've been played for a sucker and you've been played for a sap. The entire system rests on your shoulders. You are the full faith and credit of this government, not the SEC, not the Federal Reserve, not this group of scum up there, right? The sociopathic overlords on Wall Street. You think they give a damn about this country? You think you give a damn about its citizens? You think you give a damn about what happened in Lexington and Concord 250 years ago? They were the guys on the other side. They were the city of London, the Wall Street at the time, financing the empire against the colonists. That was the little guy standing up and say, hey, go F yourself. You're going to have to come and take it. Do we have that balls and guts today? That is the only question that matters.
He said it right there. He's talking about Lexington and Concord 250 years ago. Still talking about the British Crown in the city of London, which I was warned the other day to make clear more often. It's like you never talk about this. Talk about it all the time. The British Crown and the monarchy are not the same. British Crown is the city of London, the global financiers. Okay? So he's talking about that 250 years ago and still being the same thing that's active today. What does that mean about the nation's past and the influence of the global banking regime and the influence of the British Empire, which was then switched over to the American Empire? And actually, I lied. Let's finish on this. We'll just go through the end. I was going to go through this more extensively, but let's just do the end here. Trump's not hurting democracy. He's blowing up their oligarchy, which is why they're so mad. This appeared in all places. The Hill, which is not a MAGA-oriented news outlet whatsoever. So just the end here. The desperate attempt to portray President Trump's shock and awe campaign against the entrenched Washington oligarchy as an attack on democratic institutions continues with another laughable claim that his battle against the legacy news media cartel imperils the freedom of the press. Trump took the long overdue step of relegating dying, untrustworthy, and untrusted mainstream media organs to a back seat in the White House press briefings, while giving the alternative media a position in the press pool justified by their newly robust influence. As Trump piles up wins against the administrative state and its beltway dependents, the last refuge of establishment scoundrels is to depict his spate of executive orders and his ferreting out of administrative waste and fraud as an unconstitutional assault on legislative authority. And again, there is no legislative authority, okay? We don't elect them, and they don't work on our behalf. That's all that matters. Right? You can't cling to a system that doesn't exist. Even though Trump explicitly campaigned on the promise of having Elon Musk run a Department of Government Efficiency to discover waste and abuse in executive branch agencies, that popular effort is now being challenged in court by the bureaucracy and characterized as an attempt to bend U.S. institutions to his will. In other words, he is attempting to ensure that employees of the executive branch who work at the will of the president carry out the will of the executive. The deep state obviously became complacent about its ability to call the shots in Washington. Otherwise, its critique of the first serious assault on its heretofore unchallenged power wouldn't be so transparently ridiculous. Well done. Well done, The Hill. I can't believe they published it. I don't know that any of their readers will actually read that and take the lesson in it, although you can hope. Maybe they're waking up the normies. All right, to the chat. Rocks cry out, $20. My hold for processing never seems to be over. Are you talking about a personal issue here, or is there a tech? Oh, he actually responded and said, no, I actually just realized that I'm a technotard. Well, don't beat yourself up. The hold for processing wasn't that long. It was like 3 seconds. Jay Drake says, wait, hold on, let me cue it up. He says, first, APL. Got to get one in. Second, a gold coin worth £1 British pound is called a sovereign. Tacit admission of where the true power lies. Very interesting. I did not know that. Thank you very much for that. Excellent little knowledge, little bit of knowledge there. Let me see if I can actually just make sure nobody asks questions in the Substack responses any longer. So I don't know. Maybe the subscriber stream is not what we should do. I don't know. We'll have to figure that out. Moving forward. Okay. So my plan Friday, it is very unlikely that I'm going to do an episode. First off, I'm going out of town and we'll be back on Friday. But if there's not something that like is pressing to talk about, then it's better to have more prep time for shows with this format, because I can't work and prep at the same time, which is what I was able to do in the audio only format. And so I'm going to talk to John. I may be able to post the Badlands Story Hour from last night, featuring, of course, Burning Bright and I discussing Top Gun Maverick, but retired Lieutenant General Stephen Quast, who is himself a fighter pilot and former Top Gun, joined us to talk about the movie, and we had a great conversation, as we always do with General Quast. As I said on the show, it was a treat and an honor to have him there, to have him join us. I really look up to that guy, a world of respect for him. His participation with Badlands and with the GART events has been just such an asset. So I'm going to try to maybe post that on the podcast stream on Friday so that people can hear that. And then next week, I might see what things are like with a 2-show format, either Tuesday and Friday or Monday and Thursday, and see if maybe that, as we transition to this, maybe that allows me to get enough headspace where I can refrain from focusing all of my energy keeping up with the daily news cycle, which will then allow me to focus more energy on writing, which would allow me to be productive along that avenue. If that works, then maybe I just keep the live streams going. And if not, then I will, within the next, 6 weeks or so, 2 months, transition into that hiatus that I've been kind of occasionally discussing here and there. Okay. And so with that, I will see you early next week. Same reasonable time on the Same Reasonable Podcast Network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic. And Joe Biden was never president.
Well,
what?
You know who I am, don't you?
Well, you ain't Fiona Apple, and if you ain't Fiona Apple, I don't give a rat's ass.
What's wrong with being an angry prophet denouncing the hypocrisies of our times? What do you think, Max?
Do you want to be an angry prophet denouncing the hypocrisies of our times?
Yeah, I think I'd like to be an angry prophet denouncing the hypocrisies of our times.
It's not true. It's more true than I would perhaps prefer.
Can we stop this cruel game and allow the boy to keep one shred of dignity? For God's sakes! I can't stand to see him in all this pain! You vicious bastards! Let him move in with you! Is it so bad to see somebody happy? So just let him move in! For the love of God, let the boy move in with you! Good Lord!
And I will not let you down.
We do a little trolling. It's called We Do a Little Trolling.
What? In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening for free and would like to support the show, the best way to do that is by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can find the info stream over on Telegram at t.me/veryreasonable. The merch site is cancelcouture.com, and for all my other links, you can visit linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon. Down on the range.